there. All right, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Welcome. We're going to get started. So tonight's presentation is part of an ongoing effort by the Shomerei Adamah, Protectors of the Earth Committee here at Mount Zion to educate the congregation about environmental issues. So if you have any questions about the committee, please speak with Michael Cooney or to me. I'm Alexandra Klass. I'm a member of the Shomerei Adamah Committee. And the charge to our committee from the Mount Zion Board of Directors was to oversee the implementation of the congregation's efforts to educate and advocate around responses to climate change, to cultivate resilient spirits as we respond to the climate crisis, and to establish sustainable practices for our buildings, grounds, and programs. This evening's session with Catherine Hoffman from MCEA and Zoe Klass-Warch from the Rockefeller Family Fund is part of our Educate and Advocate mission. So first I'll introduce Catherine, and then after Catherine speaks, I'll introduce Zoe, and then Zoe will speak, and then we'll have some Q&A, and they can answer your questions about these issues. So very pleased to introduce Catherine Hoffman. She is the Chief Executive Officer of the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, which is the state's premier nonprofit environmental advocacy organization founded here right in St. Paul over 50 years ago. So Catherine leads an in-house team that includes some of Minnesota's foremost environmental law, policy, and subject matter experts. MCEA advocates for environmental protection efforts at the legislature, with Minnesota state agencies, and also in the Minnesota and the federal courts. Catherine has both a law degree and a public policy degree from the University of Minnesota. And after working in complex litigation at a private law firm in Minneapolis, she joined MCEA as a staff attorney back in 2010 and became the CEO in 2017. And since she began her leadership role, MCEA has grown significantly in both size and influence. And it was a privilege and an honor for me to have been a longtime board member at MCEA, so I'm really excited about our program today. Catherine's going to focus her remarks on two important topics. The first topic is the Climate Superfund bill that was introduced in the Minnesota legislature this past session and was chosen by the Shomerei Adamah Committee at Mount Zion as a priority for the committee's educate and advocate efforts for this year. And then the second topic she's going to speak about is environmental justice, which is really top of mind today as we recognize and celebrate the Juneteenth holiday. In Minnesota and around the world, communities of color are the first and hardest hit by climate change. Legal actions and legislation, in addition to community-centered approaches that strengthen and uplift our most overburdened communities, are really needed to address a legacy of environmental racism here in Minnesota and across the United States. So please welcome Catherine Hoffman.
Well, thank you, Alex, for that lovely introduction, and thank you so much for having me here today. This is actually my first time inside Mount Zion, and it's such a beautiful building that you all have. And I was very excited to learn that you're adding solar power to the roof, so that's such a cool thing to be doing. I looked at your display out there. So. Yes, and I'm grateful to be here in particular on Juneteenth because environmental justice is very central to what my organization does on our work as environmental lawyers. And the reason that environmental justice is central to what we do is that it's really the same thing. Environmental law and social justice are intertwined in ways that really can't be ignored when you're working on either issue. So we already know, as Alex mentioned, that environmental harms are concentrated in areas where residents have less political power. And particularly in the United States, that means that's based on race and it's based on income. And so one way that I talk about this sometimes, and this is language that's used in academic disciplines as well, is this idea of sacrifice zones. So a sacrifice zone is an area where a polluting facility is sited, and the laws are not necessarily strictly enforced. And the assumption is, well, we got to have this facility somewhere, right? And so we need to put it in a place, and someone has to bear the cost of that pollution. And so therefore it ends up in places where people don't have the political power to increase those standards or hold those facilities to a higher standard of environmental protection. The thought experiment that I find helpful here to really understand this is to imagine for a moment that all communities have the same amount of political power. We would still presumably need to have some place to put industrial facilities. But overall, we would see much stricter standards for those facilities because all communities would be equally protected by the law and have their public health, their air, their water, equally respected. And so in a way, lax environmental standards exist and are allowed to happen in the United States directly because of the structural racism that disempowers communities of color and low-income communities. So racism and environmental harms are interlinked. Climate impacts, in particular, are tied to race and income also. So data shows us that how resilient you are as an individual, as a family, as a community, depends on your access to resources in the event of a climate disaster. So storms, heat waves, disasters all hit low-income communities the hardest, and they find it the hardest to recover. And so there is no climate justice without racial justice. So my organization, we're largely an environmental law organization, and I want to just say a little bit about what that means. So we're lucky here in Minnesota to be kind of swimming in environmental organizations. We have quite a lot of them, you may have noticed, and that's wonderful. And they're organized in different ways. So some organizations, for example, might be organized around a place. They want to protect the boundary waters or the Mississippi River or a particular system of lakes. Other organizations might be organized around like a medium like water or energy. We're a little bit different in that we're environmental lawyers, and so that means that we're really organized around a tool, which is being able to use the law in order to get things done. And that might be lobbying, it might be working with the administration, the state administration, and the agencies to try to make permits better or rules better, or it might be going to court. And what that means, though, is we work across a wide range of topics. And so we work, for example, on sulfide mining. We work on clean water and agriculture. We work on data centers, actually, a lot right now. We work on clean energy. And so we have a group of lawyers that go up to the Public Utilities Commission, which regulates all of our investor-owned utilities in Minnesota. And we show the Public Utilities Commission how it is that those utilities can transition to clean energy faster than they maybe were already proposing to do so. So we make sure coal plants get closed, that we're not replacing those with gas plants, and we're bringing online as much wind and solar and batteries as possible. And as a result of this work, there's been a lot of success. So every coal plant in Minnesota at this point has either been retired or is scheduled to be retired in the next few years, which is very exciting. And so we have, in terms of that trajectory, quite a lot of success. When we work, I want to highlight a few of our projects that specifically relate to environmental justice and this idea of sacrifice zones. So one that I want to mention is the Smith Foundry. People may remember this. This was an iron foundry in Minneapolis that closed. Time is hard to keep track of sometimes, but I think about a year ago, maybe 18 months. And this was an iron foundry in a neighborhood in Minneapolis. And what happened was the EPA showed up. They did a surprise visit at this facility. And what they found was that all of the pollution control equipment that was supposed to prevent pollution from coming out of the stacks was laying broken on the floor. and nobody had used it for some time, that they weren't keeping records of they were supposed to be, testing their emissions to make sure they weren't too high, they weren't doing any of that. There were all kinds of problems. And at that point, the community contacted us as environmental lawyers and said, hey, we really need some help. And so the state agency, our pollution control agency, entered into, they filed a complaint against this facility, which is a good thing for them to do. But at that point, there was negotiations between the state agency and the company. But at no point was the community represented. They were not in the room for those. And so when they approached us as attorneys, we said, well, here's what we can do. We can intervene in that proceeding. And then the community also gets to say directly to the judge what it is that they want. And what they wanted was the facility to shut down. They didn't want it to be improved and maybe have another chance to comply with the Clean Air Act. From their perspective, trust was broken, and they wanted it to close. And ultimately, that is what happened. And I'm proud to announce that that facility, in fact, did close, and the air in that area is much cleaner now, including the daycare that was directly across the street. So this is a big difference for the residents who live nearby. Another example that we work on is something called the Cumulative Impacts Law. This was a big legislative win that happened in 24, I forget. Whatever year we passed all the laws. 24. That passed in 24, goodness. It's been a long week. This law is directly aimed at improving conditions for communities that are experiencing environmental racism. And so right now, like under the Clean Air Act, for example, you get a permit, and the permit limits how much pollution you can put out. But they're not necessarily looking at if there's a concentration of facilities. So they might say, okay, here's this one facility, it's standing alone, and what it's putting out is not unsafe to people around it. But they're not asking the question, if there's 4 facilities, does the cumulative impact of those multiple facilities, is that harmful to public health? And often that is happening in low-income or communities of color. And so our cumulative impacts law here in Minnesota actually allows our state agencies to take a look at that and say, hey, are we looking at cumulative impacts from multiple facilities in this area? And if so, do we need to deny or modify an air permit? Now, most people think if you go to the legislature and you get something passed, the fight's over. But environmental lawyers know that's not the case. What we know is that actually a lot of the real work happens after that through something called rulemaking. And that's where state agencies put in the specifics of how are we actually going to enforce this? How are we actually going to apply it to a particular company looking for a permit? It's really where the rubber hits the road. And that's where we specialize a lot of the time. So that cumulative impacts rulemaking is happening right now. And actually there's an open comment period at this very moment. And so that's an opportunity to shape this really important law that we have, because if it's interpreted too laxly, it's the kind of thing that really can undercut the original purpose of the law. I mean, they can pass rules, can be how they interpret the statute and the rules might mean that everything that we were trying to do at the legislature gets nullified if the rules aren't good enough. So we want to really keep those rules strong. All right, so those are a couple examples of things that we work on at the intersection of the environment and racial justice. And I want to talk about specifically this law that the committee has chosen as its purpose, which is the Climate Superfund Law. All right, so Climate Superfund. Let's start with the second word, Superfund. I think you probably know what climate means. So Superfund Law, we have a Superfund law in the United States, but it really relates to sort of land and water contamination. It's often referred to as CERCLA. And this Climate Superfund is kind of based on that as a model. So under the current CERCLA or Superfund law, It's basically a way to take a polluted piece of land and go back and find the original polluters and hold them accountable, make them pay for it. So for example, if there's a piece of land that had a factory on it for years and the factory closed, and that land is now polluted because maybe they dumped on it, or things leaked out the back or whatever, stuff happened on the site, the Superfund law can help the state or the federal government go back and get money from that company in order to clean up that site and then pay for that cleanup. And if there's multiple polluters, then they allocate that out. They try to figure out, which polluter is most responsible and then kind of allocate the costs accordingly. So take the same concept and apply it to the climate. A relatively small number of polluters have actually caused the problem to our climate, and we know who they are. And so this bill gives us an opportunity to hold them responsible. And it allows us to hold them responsible, particularly around cost, because climate change has cost Minnesotans a lot of money. In fact, in a study that was just released by the state in March, a study shows that without additional adaptation efforts, so if we do nothing going forward and we continue to emit greenhouse gases at the same rate, Minnesotans can expect to see more than $20 billion worth of climate damages every single year by 2030. By the end of the century, if global greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise and no adaptation actions are taken, the estimated cost will be more than $50 billion. And that includes probably not everything, frankly, but includes health and well-being, like public health. It includes damage to agriculture and livestock, transportation, electricity, buildings, and ecosystems. However, the cost of adaptation and resilience that will put us in a much better place in order to weather this there's still costs to it, but it's way less. The adaptation costs are around $2.5 to $4 billion a year. And we'll be much better off if we do that. So it's costly either way. I mean, climate change is costly, and I don't think we should ignore that fact. But finding money for adaptation and resilience is much better than just doing business as usual, and will help avoid some of that massive toll on our lives and our economy. So what does this bill do? So first, it tasks our state auditor with calculating the costs. So these numbers, this was a preliminary report. A state auditor will do something more precise as far as what does it cost us and what will it cost us, based on past greenhouse gas emissions. And then it assesses those costs to fossil fuel companies based on their percentage of those past emissions. And then once those are assessed, that goes into a fund that's managed by our Minnesota Pollution Control Agency to fund both the costs of climate impacts like disasters and things like that, as well as proactive climate adaptation and resilience. And in order to be assessed, a company has to have done business in Minnesota, and it has to have be responsible for over 1 billion tons of carbon emissions, which is really a lot. That's about 1/6 of what the United States emits every year. And then they're emitted their percentage based on the total of all of those companies together, if that makes sense. We don't know exactly how much this will produce in terms of a fund because the state auditor needs to figure that out, but it's likely to be tens of billions of dollars. It's likely to be a good fund for the Minnesota to start to adapt to some of these impacts. So this money can be used for disaster response and recovery. It can also be used for climate adaptation and resilience projects, so like disaster preparedness, flood mitigation, stormwater infrastructure, and resilience centers in communities. And relevant to environmental justice, 40% of those funds need to go to disadvantaged communities. A disadvantaged community is defined actually in reference to that cumulative impacts law. The same communities that are protected there will also be prioritized for use of these funds. So this is really an exciting opportunity. Zoe's going to talk a little bit more about what's happening nationally with this, but this will make Minnesota a leader on climate impacts. and climate legislation. This is going to be a priority for us next legislation, and I hope it will be a priority for you as well. This bill was introduced last year, both in the House and the Senate, but like many things last year in a very divided legislature did not pass. Our hope is that we will have a more sympathetic legislature this coming year. Those same authors will continue. We had 35 authors in the House and 5 in the Senate, which is actually the maximum. You can't pile them up the way you do in the House, but lots of other supporters as well. So there's a lot of support for this and a lot of opportunity for residents to get involved and help make this happen. Because as the legislature is setting their agenda for this coming year, what they hear from their constituents is really important. And so it's very important that they're hearing from their constituents that climate is important. And people are often surprised by this because I think it's often, it's easy for us to convince ourselves as single people in a big state or in a big country that we're powerless and that our voice doesn't matter and that our politicians aren't listening to us. But I will tell you, multiple times, I've had conversations up the legislature with legislators, and they will say to me, this particular issue, it's really a big deal. I'm hearing a lot from my constituents. It's really important to them. And I've asked, well, what does that mean, a lot? Like, what are you hearing? And they'll say, well, I got 7 phone calls. 7 phone calls. I mean, how many people are in this room, right? It's actually like, and signing email petitions and things like that are also good, but phone calls, like if you call up your legislator, you will be heard. They're not always going to agree with you, but you're going to have an impact. They're going to understand that this is important to their constituents. There's also opportunities to reach out to leadership. It's usually most powerful to talk to your own legislator, but when you have like a committee chair or somebody who is presiding over a particular hearing, statewide contacts to that person can also be very effective because they're becoming beholden to a larger portion of the state at that point. So this upcoming session is going to be a great opportunity to influence that legislation, and I'm excited to hear more and work with you all some more about making that happen. I'll hand it back. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Catherine. So now I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Zoe Klaas-Warch. Zoe grew up here at Mount Zion and now lives in New York City and is the program manager for the Climate Accountability Initiative at the Rockefeller Family Fund. So in that role, she supports RFF's philanthropic and advocacy efforts to make oil and gas companies pay their fair share of the cost of climate pollution. And RFF does this through support for lawsuits in the courts brought by states and local governments. You may be familiar with the lawsuit that the Minnesota Attorney General brought a few years ago against the oil and gas industry. That's pending in court right now. And RFF also supports efforts to enact Climate Superfund laws around the country that we're talking about today. So Zoe's going to tell you more about the Rockefeller Family Fund's work in this area and provide more of a national perspective on the Climate Superfund legislative efforts that are taking place in multiple states around the country, not just in Minnesota. And these efforts are building on successful efforts to pass such laws in New York and Vermont. So those were passed in 2024. Those are the first 2 that were passed. So at this point, I will turn it over to Zoe.
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be back here after having spent so much time here as a kid. And I'm really happy to be here on Juneteenth talking about Climate Superfund legislation because I see climate and racial justice as part of the same fight. As Catherine talked about, climate change is not affecting everyone equally. Communities of color and low-income communities are disproportionately exposed to climate harm, including extreme weather, flooding, and heat. And a Climate Superfund is one of the most direct tools that we have to get adaptation and resilience infrastructure to communities bearing the brunt of the climate crisis and actually shift the burden from those who have contributed the least to the problem to the actors that are the most responsible. And so to give a little background as to why the Rockefeller Family Fund is relevant to Climate Superfund, and I'll refer to it as RFF. RFF is a public charity that works in partnership with state-based organizations, advocates, and other funders to advance environmental and social justice. And its Climate Accountability Initiative seeks to hold the fossil fuel industry accountable in the courts and in the legislatures for its outsized role in climate change. And RFF, because of its history and ties to the oil industry, it's been one of the most symbolically powerful voices in the movement for corporate climate accountability. In 2015, RFF funded the investigative reporting that revealed that Exxon had conducted advanced climate science research as early as the 1970s. So their own scientists understood the dangers of global warming, and then the company proceeded to spend decades funding efforts to deceive the public about climate change. So that reporting kind of led to what became known as the Exxon New campaign. And that movement has since catalyzed more than 30 lawsuits filed by cities and states against fossil fuel companies for climate deception and damages. But it also laid the foundation and public demand for something distinct from the litigation, which is the Climate Superfund legislative approach. So RFF actually developed the concept for Climate Superfund legislation. And unlike the lawsuits that I just mentioned, the legislation is not punitive. It's a compensatory approach. Because these companies were responsible, they've been profiting, and they had the deep knowledge of the harm that they would be causing, the appropriate legislative response is to ask them to help pay for some of these damages. And there's a growing field called climate attribution science that now makes it possible to link climate damages to the carbon emissions of individual fossil fuel companies and actually assign proportional liability to them. So zooming out nationally, considering all this growing public demand and the science that makes proportional liability possible, 2 states have passed Climate Superfund laws already. Vermont was the first in 2024, and then New York followed shortly after. And since then, the movement has really taken off. 12 states this year have introduced and reintroduced Climate Superfund legislation, which is more than double from 2024. And RFF supports public education campaigns led by state-based organizations such as MCEA and the 100% campaign here in Minnesota. So we support most of these states. And to give you a sense of scale, New York's law will bring in $75 billion over 25 years, and $1 billion a year is going explicitly to environmental justice communities in New York. And New Jersey's proposed bill is set at $50 billion. And I mentioned New Jersey because New Jersey has the best chance of passing a Climate Superfund bill this year, potentially by the end of this month, hopefully. And so for most other states trying to pass these bills, 2026 has been largely a building year. So kind of laying the groundwork, building out the coalitions, and moving through committees with the intention to actually pass the legislation in 2027. And so while the bills vary from state to state, Minnesota, Maine, and Maryland took a slightly different approach as the other states. So instead of going straight into a Superfund bill, they first passed state-specific climate cost study bills that actually assess the financial impacts of climate change at the state level. And then they use that as kind of the foundation and the evidentiary basis for the Climate Superfund legislation. So I think that's really smart sequencing, and it's something that Catherine spoke to with Minnesota. And so while all these campaigns are underway, Vermont and New York's Climate Superfund laws are currently being challenged in court. As expected, the fossil fuel industry is fighting back. Both states are being sued by the federal government and a coalition of red state attorneys general led by West Virginia, and industry groups led by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the American Petroleum Institute. Their arguments are that these laws are unconstitutional and they're preempted by the Federal Clean Air Act. And the state's response is that, this isn't about controlling future emissions, it's about accountability for past harms, and it's a retroactive fee and not a production regulation. So the cases in New York and Vermont have been fully briefed, and no court has ruled on the merits yet. But even if New York and Vermont face legal setbacks, the federal courts are divided into regional circuits. So ruling in one doesn't automatically apply everywhere else. So a bad outcome in one of those states does not close the door for other states and other circuits trying to enact their own Climate Superfund legislation, which is why states like Minnesota should keep on pushing forward even as the litigation in New York and Vermont is pending. And so back to Minnesota, Reform synagogues made a major difference in passing New York's Climate Superfund bill into law, and I believe that you can be just as significant here. So I'm really happy that and inspired that you're aligning the community to try to advance this really important legislation.
All right, thank you, Zoe. So we have about 15 minutes or so for questions, and I've got microphones for everyone. So why don't I give each of you one of these? I think that's on. They're all on. Maybe we don't want them all on at the same time. Right. Okay. And then, do you guys want to come up? And then, I mean, obviously, I could ask lots of questions, but we want to take questions from the audience. So why don't I call on people in the third row right there?
It's nice to hear this, but the loudest voice in the country is saying this is all a hoax. And you talked about some of the businesses that have big money to fight it. How are you going to get the message out, especially to young people who are supposedly going to live the longest and they have the most to lose from climate change that it doesn't happen?
Well, okay, so I'll go first, and then Catherine can follow. I think there are a lot of communications efforts to try to activate young Americans to try to get behind the climate accountability movement. So one of the organizations that comes to mind is Fossil Free Media, and they have been really, really good at, educating the wider public about litigation and legislation. Trying to, litigation can be very hard to and inaccessible, and so they have a lot of people on social media, on TikTok, trying to make it more of a public issue, and so yeah, that's an organization to watch out for.
I think that, ooh, that was loud. I'll put it down here. One of the ways this administration has been very successful, I think, is not necessarily on any individual issue. So, for example, with climate change, the polling remains quite bipartisan, that more Americans are concerned about it, more Americans are alarmed about it, and that's true. It is true that that's a higher percentage among Democrats, but you do see higher number among Republicans, and you see higher number among younger Republicans in particular. And so, but what I think has been unfortunately really effective by this administration is what we at MCEA sometimes refer to as the flood the zone strategy. This is a term that I can see is familiar to some folks. The flood the zone strategy is sort of new outrages and new things happening every day, such that by the time you've sort of understood and tried to react to one thing, there's something else the next day. And it's actually, things get lost, things get ignored. It's very overwhelming for most of us. And so, of course, here in Minnesota, we have the impacts of climate change, but we have the Senate voting to pull back protections in the boundary waters. We have Operation Metro Surge, and all the various other ways that the administration is targeting us in particular as a state for whatever reason. And so the task for us, I think, as citizens and as activists in this time is to not let that overwhelm us or make us lose hope, and to find the issue that we don't have to solve all the issues all the time, but find an issue that you care about, focus on it, and stick with it, and there will be opportunities. I mean, the pendulum will swing back, and so that, I think, is the way to hold on to what's important to you in this particular moment.
Minnesota successfully sued the tobacco industry for the harm it had
this might really be for Alex, but I can. So absolutely. So the Climate Superfund, this bill is a little bit different because that's really looking at allocating damages. However, the Minnesota Attorney General, Keith Ellison's office, brought a suit against big oil polluters, against Exxon and the Koch brothers, that is currently in court. And it is based on that model of the tobacco suits. And in particular, it's this idea of consumer fraud, that these companies, just like the tobacco companies did, now the oil and fossil fuel companies have worked to muddy the question of the harm of their products, right? They're hiring, and Zoe talked about this issue of climate deception and the studies, like they've hired scientists to say, climate change may or may not be real, to create a lot of uncertainty. Maybe it's not attributable to our products. Maybe it's just kind of a natural phenomenon. And make it seem like it's not a very strong connection in a way that made it so that as people continued to use the products, it was hard for them to know what harm it might cause. And that is a violation of consumer fraud laws. You can't lie about stuff that you sell. And so that is the model of that suit that has been brought. Other states have brought these suits as well, other attorneys general. And the fight at the moment has been largely over whether they belong in state or federal court. So we're in early days on these suits, but we will see those continue to move forward, I think.
I'll just add one thing on that is if you look on YouTube, there is a seminar that was hosted at the University of Minnesota Law School back in 2019, I think. And we had people talking about, climate attribution, some of the science that Zoe mentioned, but also had some of the lawyers from the Robbins Kaplan firm who had sued the tobacco industry on behalf of the state of Minnesota and the health insurers, talking about the connections between lawsuits against the oil industry and lawsuits against the tobacco industry, and that really was the model. This was before Minnesota brought its suit, but Keith Ellison was actually at the seminar and was kind of listening, and then the Minnesota lawsuit was brought soon after. So the seminar is still on YouTube, at least last time I checked, and it's really interesting because you hear that connection, and so and in the context of Minnesota, so that might be helpful. Then the only other thing I would say to keep in mind on some of the litigation is, as Catherine said, states and local governments across the country have brought similar suits to the one that the Minnesota Attorney General brought, and the U.S. Supreme Court is actually hearing arguments on one of the suits in Colorado on some of the legal issues. That'll be over the next year, so that's something to keep in mind as well. Other questions? Way in the back. Rob.
So you spent a lot of time talking about remedial action to address these issues. Back in the 90s here in Minnesota, the Pollution Control Agency had an incentivizing program for companies that would reduce their hazardous waste emissions by at least 50%. I'm wondering, A, are these programs still in existence? And B, do you have any new efforts on the front end to try and reduce emissions as opposed to the remedial?
Yeah, this is maybe a good opportunity to talk about some of our other climate change laws that are in place. I don't actually know if that specific program is still in place, but we do have some other strategies that are aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions in Minnesota. By far the most effective, I would say, is our law that was passed also in 2024, which is our 100% clean energy law. And this law says that we as a state, for our investor-owned utilities, our energy companies, they need to produce all of their electricity for Minnesota in a way that's carbon-free by 2040. So we need to have zero carbon emissions out of our electricity by 2040. And we're actually well on our way to this goal. We're over 50% carbon-free in Minnesota. And over the past year, for example, almost everything that's come online, about 98% of what's come online in terms of new energy resources has all been wind, solar, and batteries. It's all been carbon-free. There are, and so that's a really powerful law that we have, and our Public Utilities Commission is working to make sure that our utilities are actually following it. There's a couple headwinds on that. One of them is projected increased demand. We're expected to see a lot more demand come online, specifically from data centers in the next few years, although there's other things too, electric vehicles and other things, more things that we plug in our lives, also projected to increase demand. So that means we're going to need to speed our transition to clean energy in order to keep up with that. That's one particular headwind. Another is the Trump administration is going around the country and ordering coal plants to stay open. Don't know if people have seen this particular trend. There's one in Michigan, and not far from Ann Arbor in the Detroit area. And then there's there's others around the country. I think 6 states have them at this point. We do have 2 coal plants here in Minnesota that are both slated for closure in the next couple of years. And in particular, our largest coal plant, Sherco in Sherburne County, is slated for closure by the end of this year. And I fully expect the Trump administration to order that one to stay open. So that is another headwind as well. So there is some work to do there and will continue to be, but that's been a very effective law. Now that law does not get at our other sectors. Transportation is actually our biggest in Minnesota. Agriculture is number 2, I believe, as well as buildings and industry. So those are all areas where we still need to pass laws in order to make sure we continue to make progress.
In the back row of the pews here. Yeah, right there. Yeah.
I guess the first question, speaking of utilities, is you guys have looked at like consolidation of the utility industry, or private equity coming in, and impacts from that, like LEAP up in the booth. It's private equity go to AES in Indiana too. And then also just kind of the environmental and social impacts of big data centers, big ones are going in, Rosemount, also in your booth too. Just curious thoughts there on those couple of topics.
Yeah. I just don't want to be a ball hog. Okay. Data centers is the second one. The first one was, the private equity. Yeah, so, Elite is the parent company for Minnesota Power, and last year they were acquired by BlackRock. By a private equity and their firm. And there was lengthy hearings at our Public Utilities Commission about whether people thought this was a good idea. And a lot of people are very concerned because private equity has, a run of doing not great things with companies, stripping out their assets and destroying their value. And this is a public utility. We can't be destroying its value. We have to be making it work for the public. Nevertheless, the Public Utilities Commission did approve that sale. I will say that already, that company, Minnesota Power, has come back with a proposal to build a new gas plant. And so it does seem like they are moving more towards a fossil fuel model at the moment. My organization is fighting that. So we put in some comments and explained to the Public Utilities Commission how, in fact, they don't need that gas plant and we can do this all through clean energy. And that's an issue that's pending in front of the PUC. There is a bill that was introduced last year, and I assume will come back again, banning in Minnesota the acquisition of public utilities by private equity, which I think a lot of folks think is something that might be good to do, and just in order to make sure that we maintain the public purpose of our utilities. As far as data centers, this is a big issue. We have as many as 10 data centers coming in with proposals to Minnesota. And they do, the smallest one is 100 megawatts. The bigger ones can be 500, 600 megawatts or more. That number may not mean anything to you, which is totally fair. But to give you a sense of it, there's a proposal in Hermantown. The entire Minnesota power grid is 650 megawatts. And they're proposing a 500 megawatt data center. So this is a massive change that's really going to need to be planned for. So my organization, we actually have 5 lawsuits over data centers, and they're specifically aimed at environmental study and planning, that these companies have skipped the environmental study and planning, as well as the public comment period and the opportunity for people to weigh in, and that they have to go back and do that again. And the early decisions have been positive. So one court in Pine Island said you have to halt construction until we've decided whether you have to go back and do environmental review. Another case just last week from the Court of Appeals, it was a Faribault facility. They said, no, you do actually have to go do environmental review, go start over. So the court agreed with us, and that was at the Court of Appeals. So early indications are courts do feel that these facilities have to go through planning and study and public comment before they move forward, and I think that's a good thing, because we can't, we're going to be building gas plant and fossil fuel plants if we don't plan and figure out how to handle these data centers before they come in. And there's other issues too around water, noise, and things like that that all have to be handled.
All right, well, we are at time, but I want to give both Zoe and Catherine just another moment or two, any takeaways they want to give, either about the work that they're doing or ways that you, as congregants and residents, can get involved. Zoe?
Well, I want to say thank you again for being here and, activating for the legislation. And I think you can probably speak more to the details of what it actually looks like to get involved. But there's a sign-up sheet with a link where you can sign up to, I think, coalition calls to, get updated on kind of the month-to-month of the campaign. And yeah.
Well, I actually want to do a shout out to Zoe's employer, the Rockefeller Family Foundation, because they were really one of the early charitable or philanthropic organizations in the country, from where I sit, to really get that the action needs to happen at the state level on climate change these days and really make that shift. I mean, she mentioned that study in 2015. I mean, that was before the 2016 election, right? And so that was really reading the tea leaves of, hey, we need to put our energy in places where we can have real impact. And states are where we can have real impact. And Minnesota has a lot of power to actually make things happen. Because when we take action, others follow. Other states look at us and say, hey, we can do that too. It is actually palpably different. Like if California does something, people will say, oh, well, that's California, right? Or that's even true of like New York, Vermont, right? A lot of East Coast states are like, well, yeah, but that's the East Coast. If a Midwest state does something, it matters. And nothing, and not for good reasons, but we cannot deny the fact that the country's eyes are on us right now. Minnesota is the center of attention. I am getting calls from all over the country about the work that we're doing, and how we're responding to Metro Surge, like all of the like sort of swirl of both beautiful and awful things that are happening here is really, I think, getting a lot of attention, and this is our opportunity to lead. And so yes, there's some flyers in the back. Take one, there's a QR code, and you can sign up to it's actually an immediate take action to sign a petition to support the Climate Superfund, and then you're also will get further updates as we get closer to the legislative session. So you can sign up for that. If you're not comfortable with the QR codes, there's also a pen and paper place where you can sign up also, and I'm happy to take those as well. So get involved early. And know that this is going to be a big year for Minnesota, and if that happens, then it's going to be a big year a lot of other places too, because we can be real leaders here.
Right. Thanks, Zoe. I know we didn't get to all the questions, but if you still have questions, sure they can stick around for another few more minutes. Shabbat shalom.
Explain again the methodology for estimating the cost impact.
Yeah.
How did you
For the
explain
actual fund.
that? Yeah.
So it depends state by state. So
Okay.
Vermont currently doesn't have a number set. So it's actually going through the regulatory process of actually determining the financial costs, the consequence costs. So it's it's still being done.